You see, there's something about silence that forces reflection in a way words never can. When you were there, texting, calling, making time, showing up, your presence was a constant. She didn't have to think about what life would feel like without you because you were always just there, available, emotionally open. And in her mind, that became the default, that became normal. And the moment something becomes normal, it begins to blend into the background. People stop seeing what's always in front of them. But when you let her go, truly let her go, you shattered that rhythm. You removed your energy from her life, not with spite or anger, but with quiet conviction. And that contrast, that absence, it does something powerful. It confronts her with a version of reality she hadn't really considered. One where you're not reachable, one where your attention isn't guaranteed, one where her name doesn't light up your screen anymore. And in that space, she begins to feel something she didn't expect, loss. It's a psychological shift. Because when you stop chasing, when you stop feeding the dynamic, the weight of your absence forces her to finally see what she was blind to when she had it. She starts remembering the small things, how you listened, how you made her laugh, how you noticed things no one else did. But now, instead of those moments being comfortably present, they become memories, and memories have a way of growing louder in the quiet. That's when emotional contrast kicks in. She starts comparing. Not necessarily with other people, but with how she felt when she was with you. And that comparison is never neutral. It's amplified by the silence you've left behind. The very same things she once overlooked now feel rare. The security she didn't acknowledge now feels precious. And the emotional presence she took lightly now feels irreplaceable. But here's the important part. She doesn't fall in love with who you were then. She falls in love with who you became after you let go. Because walking away with peace, without bitterness, without resentment, shows strength. It shows self-respect. It shows that your world isn't built around chasing someone who isn't ready. And that's what makes you unforgettable. Letting her go isn't about manipulation. It's about truth. It's about creating space for clarity. And often it's only in that space that she truly understands what you meant to her. You don't need to tell her. The silence does it for you. There's a fundamental misunderstanding many people carry into relationships. They think love is something that can be convinced, negotiated, or reasoned into existence. They believe that if they just say the right words, explain how much they care, or try a little harder, the other person will finally see their worth. But love doesn't respond to persuasion. It responds to presence, to energy, and most of all, to detachment. Because when you cling to someone emotionally, when you chase after their approval or their affection, you're not drawing them closer, you're pushing them further away. There's something deeply unattractive about neediness, not because wanting someone is wrong, but because emotional dependence signals a lack of inner stability. When someone feels that you need them to validate your sense of worth, it creates a power imbalance. And people instinctively pull away from what feels emotionally heavy, even if they don't fully understand why. You might think that constantly reaching out, explaining how much they mean to you, or trying to fix the relationship will reignite the connection. But it rarely does. In fact, it often cements the emotional distance. What works instead is detachment. Not coldness, but strength. Detachment says, I care about you, but I won't lose myself over you. It's an unspoken message that you're whole with or without them. And that kind of energy is magnetic. When you no longer beg for someone's time or affection, when you stop making yourself emotionally available to someone who's uncertain about you, they feel it. They feel the shift. You no longer orbit around their attention, and in that moment, you become unpredictable, unreachable, intriguing. Because something strange happens when you pull back with self-respect instead of resentment. You reclaim your power. And that power is noticed, not because you're trying to prove anything, but because the silence you create has weight. The absence of pursuit makes them ask questions. Why did he stop reaching out? Did he stop caring? Was I wrong about him? And in that questioning, something begins to stir. What persuasion couldn't do, emotional separation begins to unravel. The irony is, the moment you stop trying to make them love you is often the moment they begin to feel something real. Because your detachment signals value. It shows you're not emotionally desperate. It shows you trust yourself enough to let go of what's not choosing you. And that kind of calm power is rare. People feel it and they remember it. When you walk away with your dignity intact, you don't just end the chase. You begin a shift, one that no amount of talking could ever create. When you stop reaching out, when you stop showing up in the ways she had grown used to, something subtle but significant begins to happen in her mind. She starts to wonder. Not in a shallow way, not with immediate clarity, but slowly, quietly beneath the surface. You've removed yourself from the equation. And with that, you've taken away her certainty. You're no longer predictable, no longer accessible, and that unpredictability starts to create emotional curiosity. She begins to think about you, not because you're reminding her, but because your absence demands her attention. As you said, the negativity month grew. The mind naturally fills in the blanks when something familiar disappears. She used to know your routines, your tone, your patterns. She could rely on you being there in some way. But now that certainty is gone. The familiar rhythm is broken. And in that silence, the questions begin. Why isn't he calling anymore? Was he ever really that invested? Did I mean anything to him at all? And the more she tries to answer those questions, the more she revisits the past, moments you shared, things you said, the way you made her feel when no one else could. The emotional space you've left behind becomes filled with reflection. And that reflection often softens what was once ignored. People don't usually recognize what matters to them when it's constantly available. It's only when something slips out of reach that they begin to realize its value. And that's exactly what emotional curiosity does. It reframes the past through the lens of present uncertainty. She begins to feel nostalgic about things she never paid attention to while you were still there. Even your flaws might start to seem more human, more understandable. Because in the silence, there's room for a new story to be written, one where she wasn't as indifferent as she appeared, and you weren't as easily replaceable as she assumed. The thing is, we're drawn to what feels emotionally unfinished. And when you walk away without begging, without burning bridges, you leave the connection unresolved. Not in a manipulative way, but in a way that says, I'm done explaining myself. My actions were real. If you see it, you see it. If not, I'm still moving forward. That kind of closure without explanation leaves an open loop in her mind. And that loop, that gap between what she expected and what she now experiences, becomes a space where longing grows. Curiosity turns into reflection. Reflection turns into emotion. And emotion, when no longer being fed externally, starts to build internally. That's often when the heart begins to shift, not because of something you did, but because of the space you finally allowed her to feel it in. She doesn't start missing you when you go silent. She starts remembering who you were when you were still there. There's a certain respect that only comes when you stop fighting for a place in someone's life. Not out of pride, not out of bitterness, but because you recognize the quiet strength of choosing yourself over attachment. You realize that no amount of affection, effort, or sacrifice can make someone value what they're not ready to receive. And when you walk away, not in anger, but in clarity, that's when your energy begins to shift. That's when she starts to see you differently. You may have done everything right. You cared, you showed up, you supported her, you were consistent. But sometimes being good to someone isn't enough if they haven't learned to recognize what goodness looks like. If she's caught up in her own confusion, in her own need to chase excitement or validation elsewhere, then your consistency might feel boring instead of grounding. And that's not your failure. That's her emotional lens. But when you stop showing up, when you remove yourself from the position of always giving, something deeper begins to unfold. Your silence isn't passive. It becomes a mirror. It reflects her choices back at her. She begins to see what life feels like without your stability, without your care, without your quiet loyalty. And for the first time, She starts to respect what she once overlooked, not because you demanded it, not because you argued your worth, but because you stepped away. That's the paradox. We think people will respect us more if we give them more love, more access, more attention. But often, respect comes when you take it all away, when you say, I care, but not at the cost of my dignity. That boundary creates a kind of tension that's impossible to ignore. It separates those who are emotionally dependent from those who are emotionally grounded. And grounded men, those who can love deeply but still walk away, are rare. Most people expect to be chased when they pull away. They expect your patience, your pleading, your persistence. But when instead they're met with peace, with silence, with indifference that doesn't stem from hate but from healing, that's when they begin to question everything. The truth is, she starts to respect you after you let her go, because that's when she realizes you had a choice. You could have stayed in the cycle. You could have begged. You could have lowered your standards just to keep her, but you didn't. You walked. Not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about yourself not to remain where you weren't fully valued. That choice echoes louder than any confession of love ever could. Respect isn't earned by overextending yourself. It's earned by knowing when to stop. Emotional maturity doesn't reveal itself in how someone acts when everything is going well. It shows up in the silence after things fall apart. It shows in how you handle being ignored, how you respond to being dismissed, and most importantly, how you walk away when your presence is no longer honored. And the truth is, most people don't expect that. They expect chaos, outbursts, pleading. They expect you to fall apart when you're no longer wanted. But when you don't, when you hold yourself together with quiet dignity, it disrupts their entire expectation of you. That's the power of emotional maturity. It's not loud, it's not reactive, it doesn't chase. It simply acknowledges what is and lets go of what isn't. You don't try to argue your worth, you don't beg to be understood, you just move forward with your integrity intact. And that movement, that calm retreat, is often the very thing that shakes her more than any emotional display ever could. You see, emotional maturity is rare, especially in a world where people are used to drama and desperation following heartbreak. When you choose peace instead of reaction, you break the pattern, you stop the cycle. And that's not just attractive, it's unforgettable. She might not know what to call it at first, she might not even fully process it, but it lingers. It creates a presence in your absence. She starts thinking about how you handled things, about how you didn't fight to be kept, but didn't leave with resentment either, about how you carried yourself with strength instead of spite. And in her mind, that becomes a form of stability that stands out. Because most people don't offer that kind of calm. They offer chaos, or coldness, or emotional games. But you offered something else entirely. Grace. And the grace has a way of staying with her. It plays back in her thoughts, especially when she finds herself in the presence of others who don't possess it. She starts noticing the contrast. She sees how others lack the depth, the discipline, the restraint. She realizes that what she thought was ordinary was actually rare. And in that realization, something shifts. She no longer sees you as just another guy who disappeared. She sees you as the man who walked away the right way, and that difference matters. You didn't just let her go. You did it without losing yourself, without losing control. And that decision, made in silence, speaks volumes. It tells her that your sense of identity was never tied to her approval, that you had the strength to stay grounded even when your emotions could have pulled you into weakness. She might not have fallen in love with who you were when you were trying to prove your value, but she starts to fall in love with who you became when you had the courage to stop. Love doesn't always arrive in the moment. Sometimes it lingers in the aftermath. Quiet, unspoken, and painfully delayed. There's this illusion that people know exactly how they feel while things are unfolding, that they can fully process the value of a connection in real time. But the truth is, most don't. Most people only come to understand what they had when they can no longer reach out and touch it. And that's where reflection begins to do the heavy lifting. While you were present, available, and emotionally invested, she may have been distracted, unsure, or emotionally guarded. Maybe she didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe she thought she had more time. Maybe she convinced herself that what she felt wasn't enough, or that something better would come along. But then you left. And not with a storm, not with bitterness or drama, but with quiet certainty. That silence, combined with your absence, created the perfect conditions for reflection. Now there's nothing to react to. No new messages, no invitations, no effort, just space. And in that space, the mind begins to replay everything. The way you looked at her when you listened, the subtle ways you supported her without needing recognition, the conversations, the comfort, the depth. And suddenly, what once felt ordinary becomes rare. What once felt guaranteed becomes irreplaceable. Reflection reframes the past. It takes what was overlooked and puts it under a new emotional lens. And the further she gets from your presence, the more the clarity sharpens. Not because you changed, but because she did through the absence. She begins to feel what she didn't allow herself to feel before. Maybe it's regret. Maybe it's longing. Maybe it's a deeper understanding of the love she wasn't ready to face when it was ready in front of her. That's why people often fall in love after you've let go. Not because the love wasn't there before, but because they couldn't access it while it was available. Comfort dulls appreciation. Consistency becomes background noise. But the moment it's gone and they're left with only memories, that's when the emotion finally breaks through. Not because they were blind, but because they were human. And humans often only see clearly when distance is introduced. So she didn't fall in love with you when you were trying to win her over. She fell in love with you in the quiet, in the aftermath, in the days and weeks where your absence forced her to confront what she had and what she lost. She fell in love when it was too late to rewind the moment, but just in time to realize the weight of it. Sometimes the heart takes longer to catch up than we expect, but when it does, it never forgets who made it feel safe before it even knew what that meant.